Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This is the sewing tutorial for the milkmaid dress I made in my previous video. Here are all my pattern pieces laid out. I have my center front, my side front, center back and side back all laid together, and then my breast pieces that will be gathered in to fit the cups. And the center front will be cut 2 and the gathered piece, the rest will be cut 4 each. Now here is my skirt patterns laid out on one layer of the fabric. I have my side front and my center front. I've gone ahead and added my seam allowance along that panel line, and I'm going to cut one of each. Here's my center back pattern. I've placed that on my fabric and cut it out. I cut 2 pieces of this, added my seam allowance along the center back line. Starting with the bodice pieces, I'm picking one layer of that bodice piece, and I'm going to, which is the center front piece, and I'm going to pick my side front piece, one layer of it also, and pin right sides together, making sure my notches are matching, and I'm going to take that to my machine and sew on my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're going to repeat the exact same process for the facing pieces. Once that's done, you go ahead and add the other layers, other panels of your pattern pieces, which is the side back and center back. Join them all together like so, pin them down, take to your machine and sew on your 5/8 seam allowance. Once that's done, you should have something like this. Press the seam open for your main garment, and then press your seams to one side for your facing panel like this, because we're going to be using the seam allowance on the facing panel to create boning channels. Here I'm just pinning one side of the seam allowance down, and I'm going to trim the other seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. Once that's done, you're going to take the other side of the seam allowance and fold it under the trimmed seam allowance. So you fold it under the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Pin that down, take it to your machine and do an edge stitch along that casing. For my center front facing, I didn't have a seam allowance there, so I made a bias binding, and I'm going to place that down along the center front line and sew on both sides of the edge. We're going to repeat the exact same process for all the seam allowances on your facing, creating boning channels so you can pass your boning through. Once that's done, you should have something that looks clean like this. Moving on to the bust cup for our bodies, I'm going to take one panel A, and join that to panel B. I've added interfacing to all my pattern pieces, by the way. Both bodies and both main garments and facing pieces have all been lined just to add structure to the garments. I'm pinning along the bust line, the apex line. I'm going to take that to my machine and sew that down. Repeat the exact same process for all 4 cups, and then taking the gathering piece for the bust cups, I cut 2 pieces of this, one for the left, one for the right. I'm going to make gathering stitches along the edges of that pattern piece. Make 2 rows of gathering stitches so when you gather them it looks even and nice. And then I'm going to pull that gathering stitch together and gather it so it fits the cups we made earlier. This is a sample of what the cup looks like. I've gone ahead and gathered to fit that cup. Then I'm going to take that to my machine and baste around that. Once that's done, we're going to attach our cups to our bodies. Now, working on my facing piece, I'm going to take 1 cup and matching my seam allowance, my notches and making sure my seams are matching. I'm going to pin my cup around the bodies like so, and sew on my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance round that. Repeat the exact same process for the main garment, but this main garment you're going to be attaching the cups with the gathered piece to the main bodice. Take that to your machine and sew on your 5/8 seam allowance as well. Once that's done, it should look something like this. And then you're going to turn it over to the wrong side and you're going to trim the under piece of your seam allowance just to reduce bulk around the under bust area. So you're going to trim the under piece of your seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. Once that's trimmed, you're going to fold the top piece. Here I'm just going ahead to remove a layer of the interfacing just to reduce bulk. Then you're going to fold that seam allowance under the trimmed part and then pin it down. Pin it, making sure that it's catching the facing of your garment. This is also one way to create channel for underwire if you're making a proper bustier or you want to put an underwire. Then you're going to take that to your machine and edge stitch around that fold you made or that casing channel you had made. Once that's done, it should look like this. Now I'm measuring my seam allowance and I'm going to place my boning below that seam allowance and cut it. Now you don't want your boning to go past your seam allowance, otherwise it will make it difficult for you to sew it down. Once that's done, I went ahead and I pressed my boning to make them straight. I sandwiched them between a towel and I pressed them and let them cool. Here I'm using my nail file to round off the edge of the boning so it doesn't poke me when I put the garment on. Once that's done, I'm going to put my boning into the channel. Here I just placed my main garment over my facing piece, and then I basted the top edge. Then I'm going to use a bias piece to finish the raw edges of the top of my dress. So I'm pinning the bias piece on the wrong side of the fabric. Pinning along the neckline edge of the wrong side of the fabric, I'm going to take that to my machine and sew at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Once that's done, go ahead and trim down your seam allowance to a 1/8 of an inch. Then you're going to fold your bias binding over that trimmed edge, making sure to cover your already existing stitch all along the neckline. You're going to take that to the machine and make an edge stitch. This way you don't have to worry about catching both sides of the bias from the under and the top. We're going to repeat the same thing from the center back towards the side seam and towards the center front. But first I went ahead and I placed my zip down so I can catch my zip. I can finish the raw edges of my zip also. Placing my bias binding on the wrong side of the fabric, I'm going to pin along the neckline edge at the back, making my way to the front, to the underarm and to the front of my bodice piece. Then I'm going to take that to my machine and also sew at a quarter of an inch seam allowance, and then trim off my seam allowance down to a 1/8 of an inch. Once that's done, I'm going to fold my bias binding over that trimmed edge, covering my existing stitching line, and I'm going to pin all the way from the center back, the side to the side front, and pin also along the bias, pin along the front at the strap, and sew all the way, folding the strap in two. This way I'm going to be creating also the strap that goes to the back. Once you're done, it should look like this. Then I picked another strip that I cut 1 inch wide, and I just made it very long. I'm going to fold that over and stitch and make a quarter of an inch strip. Yeah. Turn that over to the right side and tie the edges of the strip, and I'm going to find the middle of that strip and pin it at my center front. At my center front bodice. Take that to my machine and tack it down to the garment, and I'm going to just make a knot and tie it there to create the ropes in front of the garments. Once that's done, we're going to move over to the skirt pieces. Here I'm just going ahead to sew down my darts. Sew the darts on all your pattern pieces. At the edge of the dart, make a knot and cut your threads. Once that's done, you're going to go ahead and press your darts. Then we're going to work on the front pieces of the skirt first. So you're taking the side front panel and attaching it to the center front panel along that line, along the side front seam. Pin all the way to your notch for where you want your slit to start, and sew that down. Using a regular stitch, sew from your waistline to where your notch is, back stitch at that point. Then I decided to make a basting stitch from that slit point where my notch is for my slit down to the hem, just so it helps me press my seams open. Here I'm going ahead to just make that basting stitch to hold those two panels in place, so it's easy for me to press it open and know exactly where my seam allowance is. Once that's done, go ahead, press your seams open, and then where the slit is going to be, we're just going to fold the seam allowance under the skirt, and then we're going to do an edge stitch just like we did for the facing piece of our bodice to make a channel for the boning. The only difference is here there's no channel. We're going to take that to the machine and make an edge stitch right across where the slit is supposed to be. Once that's done, we can set that aside and move to our back pieces. I made a basting stitch from the waistline to where I want my zip to be, and then back stitched and made a regular stitch from that point all the way to the hem of the skirt. Pressed my seams open, and now I'm going to take the front piece and join it to the back piece along the side seams of both sides. Once that's done, you should have your skirt all sewn up. Then I'm going to take my seam ripper and unpick the basting stitch I made at the center back of my skirt. Once I've unpicked that, I'm going to take my skirt piece and place it over the main garment of my bodice. That's the main bodice that does not have the boning in it. Place that down, join my skirts to the bodice piece along the waistline, making sure my side seams are matching. My front seam, princess seam that goes across the apex, is matching with my side seam on my skirt. My darts are matching at the front and at the back. I'm going to take that to my machine and sew on a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance along that waistline seam. Once that's done, you've joined your skirt piece to your main garment. Then I'm going to go ahead and attach my zip. So I just moved my facing piece out of the way and I'm attaching the zip to the main bodice of our garment. That's the bodice that's joined to the skirt piece. I'm going to pin along my seam allowance there, close my zip, and then pin my seam allowance on the other side to the zip. Once that's done, I'm going to open my zip, take that to my machine and sew my zipper down. Once that's done, your zip should look like this, nice and clean. Now to finish the waistline of the facing piece, I'm just pressing under my seam allowance. And I'm going to take that to my machine, to my ironing table, and press that down. Once that's done, I'm going to take my facing piece and fold it over my zip right sides together. I'm going to pin along the zip line edge, take that to my machine and sew that down. This is a nice way of finishing the raw edges of your zip. Once that's done, I'm going to trim along the top edge and then turn that piece over to the right side. And you should have a clean finish on your zip, around your zip edge. Once that's done, I'm going to take the facing piece that I pressed folded in and place it over the seam allowance for my main garment piece, just like this. Then I'm going to take a needle and thread and do a hand stitch closing that panel, that facing piece to the bodice of the garment, joining that facing piece to the bodice of the garment. So all along the waistline. Then your zip is complete, your garment is complete. What's left to do is to fix a hook and eye at the back and then fold the hem twice, stitch that down, try it on, and then figure out where you want how tight you want your strap, and you're done. This is my client in her milkmaid dress, looking all cute and pretty and sexy. And of course, I liked the style so much, so guess what? Yep. I had to go ahead and make one for myself as well. This is me modeling my dress, my Christmas dress. I was feeling so cute, so sexy. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you like it, please leave me a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel and share this video with your friends. Bye. Thanks for watching.